Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello everyone, it's Jen. I'm your host today for Turn the Page. I'm here with the author of a number of things, but we are here to discuss the reissue of his first volume of short stories. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Hi, Jen. Thanks for having me, and hello to all the listeners. My name is Daniel Braum, and like Jen said, we're going to talk about The Night Marchers and Other Strange Tales. It's my first volume of short stories. I'm an author. I'm classified as a horror author, but I write what are called strange tales in the tradition of author Robert Aickman. In short, they're pretty much like short stories, like an episode of that old Twilight Zone show. And they're stories where they tend to be quiet, have quiet horror, not a lot of gore, and the emphasis is on the characters and the tension between the psychological or supernatural explanations for what's happening.
Awesome. Yeah, I was so fascinated by this concept of quiet horror that you sort of describe in the intro to this volume. And the references that you all name, like they're all very dreamlike, and a lot of these stories have a very kind of dreamlike quality too. So one of the things that I love about the collection is that short stories are like always, they're very efficient in their storytelling. They're very short, you don't have a lot of space, but a lot of these like are very effective slow burns. So how do you achieve that effect? Like, how do you achieve a slow burn effect when you have so little space to do that in?
Wow, I wish I had a great answer for it. I'm tuned into my process about how I craft a story, but I probably, if I aimed for a slow burn, I'd get a roller coaster ride. And maybe that's just a funny way of saying, while I am very an intentional writer and not a pants writer, um, I am also tuned into my instincts, or at least what I want out of a story. And a lot of times the inspiration for me is setting based. So maybe it's because that there are other things that I'm interested in depicting, achieving, or just experiencing when I'm writing it. Maybe the end of that soup mix comes out as a slower burn.
Hmm. I like that. Yeah, and maybe, I wonder if it also has something to do with the fact that a lot of them are first person narratives. And so because of that, like they're all very interior too. Like you spend a lot of time in your protagonist's head, sort of like in their emotional space and with them like processing what they are going through. So I wonder if that's kind of plays in there too a little bit.
Yeah, I think you're onto something. Because as you're saying that, it dawned on me when I'm thinking, how does a slow burn, or what is a slow burn? And I think we're also talking about the same thing in terms of structure.
Mm.
I like to see stories at a place of change, be it a change of a person, their emotional state, or a place. So maybe if to show change, whether you're flagging it to the reader or not, there is a before and after, even if you're not necessarily aware that what you're reading is the before. So perhaps it's my intention in giving that before, or giving something that by the end of the story feels like a different place. The end result is a slower burn, as opposed to bam, having it be more of the opposite of slow burns.
What was it like to revisit stories from earlier in your career? Did you find anything that surprised you, or did you, like what was it like to revisit old work? Did you revisit them in any form in terms of like editing or revision, or are they all presented like sort of in their original forms?
Yeah, they were presented pretty much in their original forms. Maybe, to get like a shave and a haircut, just cleaning up some typos or things, to have an eye on that. But that's a great question, in that a lot of these stories, or some of these stories are pushing 20 years old, or even more. And I've changed as a person, and I've changed as a writer since then. So while the volume is called Strange Tales, that was a term of art, and pretty much most of the term of art, or most of the terms, I was unaware of when writing them. And now after the fact, I have since become more self-educated, more educated just in literature, in genre, in horror. So now I have an awareness of how this fits in to the scheme or a scheme of things. Whereas when I was writing them, it was more just like, hey, these are the kind of stories I like, so I'm gonna try to make them. So I looked at, and so there's an afterwards in the book where I talk about that. I write an essay about what Strange Tales and Robert Aiken means to me, and I reevaluated each story through that lens. So yeah, there really was a bit of a process as to just more than recollecting them.
Hmm. Yeah, I really like that that context that is given. And I think it like it made it a let's see, how do I say, phrase this? Like it was really fun to read that and then to see the continuities between stories. I mean, obviously they're all very different and they're playing with different genres and with different types of characters and tones. But there's a few common elements. Like you deal with like artistic protagonists a lot too. Could you talk about that choice and why you're drawn to those sorts of figures?
I think you point to something that's just delightful about reading and writing, especially collections. Like I was saying, like yeah, like you want I want to sound smart and say, well, those connections and this and that, but in actuality, yeah, that's moving back into the realm of instinct and unintended. And if you're fortunate and have a good editor, um, these sort of things appear or will just appear to the readers. So the most I can say about that is they were choices that felt right at the time. On this collection, I had no idea when writing the individual stories that they would ever see a collection. It wasn't even something on my mind. I've written several short story collections since, and the most recent one is a book called Underworld Dreams by Lethe Press. And I had a more of awareness that the book was already sold before some of the stories were completed. So I had, while there weren't intentional connections being made, I had much more of an awareness of that. And now as I'm working on a fourth collection and a fifth collection and writing stories, I have more awareness of that, and I either have to pull away or push towards that. So yeah, it is just a fun thing to see when themes um come up where people will describe a book and say a set of my work often like, oh yeah, these are water stories or water horror, and while it's pleasing, and when I go back to see it, it's definitely there. I just kind of say, of course it is. Thank you.
That is really neat. I think another thing that unites them is that they all have a really strong sense of place too. Uh,
Yeah.
you're really good at evoking very specific environments. Um, what is your approach to that? Can you talk about like how you construct a sense of place? Like I was so taken like in the very first story with like 90s New York City because I
Mm.
was in the city in college from like '01 to '05 and so many of like it felt so authentic to that time.
It's a great question. I love the question, and thank you so much. I love to hear that. And the answer to that is setting is what inspires me. We as writers can work hard and work on our craft, but where the magic, where that spark comes, like where do you get your ideas? It always comes from a setting, whether it's a real or imagined place, whether it's a place I know intimately, such as New York, or a place that I've never come before. The drive, the spark, the inspiration comes from the setting, and that's the part when I first started writing. It was also the part that came easiest to me and the part that I enjoyed. So so setting is just, yeah, it's why I write. It's why I when I was a youngster and why I read without being aware of it. When I always wanted to go somewhere when I read. My two of my favorite authors were Lucius Shepard and Tanith Lee, both very setting intensive authors.
Hmm. Yeah, and the you know the how do I phrase this part? The horror part or like the supernatural or the odd or the strange part often feels like very tied to that locale too, like very organic to sort of the place that the story emanates from. So that's a very interesting point that stories kind of start in the place for you. Is there something that you notice happening for you, like when you start to think of a place or if you visit a place maybe? Like when do you notice that like, oh, this is a story?
great question. Like you're so tuned into it. Thank you so much. Like I'm like, has she heard of my other interviews or has she? But yeah, it's really the questions are perfectly following my or perfectly anticipating my process, which is so when does it become a story? Yeah, so I'll have the idea, I'll have notes. I'm like, yeah, I want to write a story about this place, and that's where for me the craft or my craft comes in. I don't want to mislead anyone and tell them that this is what you should do, but once I know that okay, I have to write about this, that's where the conscious part of it comes in, where I will try to character will come third. I will actually, and this is usually kind of the opposite of I hear a lot of people go, oh, I come up with a character and then I come up with a conflict and then I put it in a setting. For me, it's actually the reverse because I'll have a setting and then I'll think of, well, what? Well, you can't just write about trees, right? Like you can't write about landscapes. What is the conflicts in this place? And once I start to see the conflicts, or maybe I already know a conflict or two, then I'll try to think of what's the best character to embody that and put it in dramatic structure. So yeah, that's how and once I start thinking about that, it's on its way to looking like what another human would see as a story, as opposed to just but and yeah, cool.
That's so interesting. And I wonder if that also plays into, something that I noticed in a lot of the stories too. And I'm sorry if I'm staying so vague, but I don't want to spoil too many stories for people. So, but
Oh, that's okay, as you see fit.
a lot of the stories sort of feature people sort of like encountering forces or like ancient traditions or forces or long going processes that have been going on for a long time without them, that they kind of stumble into or upon. And I wonder if that's sort of like, yeah, if the phenomena that they are encountering feel so real and lived in and old because it is part of this like considered very vivid setting, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, you're right on. You're right on. I'm seeing that. Yeah, I want to. Again, I am writing in horror, even though it is on the borderlands, or I am writing in speculative fiction, even if it's on an interstitial aspect of it. So uh, I want there to be very clearly the unexplained in these books, whether the unexplained is something to do with human processes, or as you said, wow, it's something supernatural, but we just don't understand it. I don't write about traditional things that have traditional rules, such as like, yeah, nothing against them. It's just not me. Like in a vampire story, hey, this is the vampire. Let's get our stakes. Let's get running water. Let's get the daylight. So there are still things that are supernatural in these books, but if we don't know what they are, even though that there's a sense that like the tip of the iceberg, hey, that we we know we know what we see and we perceive, but maybe we've never countered it because the readers never encountered it. It becomes a different sort of story and a different opportunity. So if it's not about cutting off the head of the bad guy, it can often become about looping back to what you said about these characters. It can become a catalyst for humanism and for the human stakes for my characters, and that is something that I really want. Um, I want to have come across. It's both organic to my process, but it's what I enjoy in stories that I read, and hopefully, I'm bringing that to readers as well.
Absolutely. So I realized that you also have a novella this month coming, The
Oh
Serpent.
yay!
Yeah, ooh.
Yeah, we're not on video. If you don't have a copy, I think you may have an advanced arc, but we can also copies just came today, so I'm excited to share them. Thank you for mentioning it.
Yeah, no problem. Do you want to talk about that story at all?
Yeah, that'd be great. The book is called The Serpent Shadow, and it's out now, and it's out now by the time you're hearing this wonderful podcast. And it's like Jen, I'm glad that Jen in the previous question said something about it. Yeah, some of the stories are about people stumbling upon ancient things or mythologies or things they don't understand. And yeah, if I had to have a single log line for The Serpent Shadow, that's exactly what happens. I also mentioned in the introduction to that book, I love stories that sort of masquerade or on the surface pretend to be or just are one thing or one genre or one trope. And then as you unwind it, becomes something else. like the movie It Follows is always an example of that. It like that movie, The Serpent Shadow appears to be a horror story that you've seen before. There's kids, there's teenagers, they're not listening to the rules, they're gonna get into trouble. It takes place in the 80s in Cancun, Mexico. But very quickly, or not so quickly, maybe slower, quickly to you, the reader, will realize that there's a lot more that meets the eye that's going on here. And the kids, the teenagers, the main characters in the story have inadvertently stumbled upon a supernatural battle for the future of Mexico between Mayans and Mexicans. Mayan culture is involved. Mexican myth of Santa Muerte, Saint Death, is involved, and that is the introduction to the Serpent Shadow from Cemetery Days.
Wow, that sounds awesome. That sounds
all right.
amazing.
Well, before we log off, we'll get a book your way. Thanks, Jen.
And I'm so glad that you mentioned It Follows too. Because I love that movie. That movie was like I thought that I could not be scared anymore. Like
yeah, right.
that movie. And then I spent like weeks terrified of that movie. But I love like that you bring that up in relation to the stories of yours that you're talking about, because it does seem like that like that ancient mythologies and or processes going on. It also is like about characters who are sort of like stumbling into a story, another story
Yeah,
that's been going
that's
on without
that's
them.
large. Yeah, that's larger than them.
Yes.
That they may or may not know the truth about. That's one of the things that's terrifying about It Follows. And even though these stories are quite horror, and sometimes I find them to be fantastical or whimsical because that's what I'm after, sometimes people tell me that they're terrified by ones I don't expect. And when I think about that, and I think it comes to do with, well, unlike in Dracula or the Wolfman, we often don't know the rules here. So like, and It Follows, what's so pleasing about it when that story goes into overdrive is like, just when they think they have a plan and just when they think they know what they've done, it's wrong. It fails. Joe Hill does it amazingly as well in his first novel, Heart Shaped Box. They think burning the suit of the ghost. He gets a haunted suit on eBay, and they think burning the suit will do it. And it's like, no, that's the one thing that you've now empowered this ghost. And so now you're like, wow, there's 3/4 of a novel left. We're in overdrive for the rest of the time. So yeah, that's one of the things I love about working in this area of the genre.
Yeah, I really like that horror sort of lets you play with like not giving closure, not explaining everything and a lot mystifying and unknown, because like that's often how we encounter things in our own lives. Like we rarely get closure about every single little storyline in our lives. I'm also reminded of Twin Peaks, which I feel like is a story about like the people who are living on the edge of a horrifying traumatic story, and how it sort of impacts their lives, but you never really see that central trauma. And I love how like horror is sort of about like specifically like the stuff that you can't see, the stuff that you don't know, and I love that.
Yeah, you hit it right on the head about not having closure, and then that's just like, yeah, a different flavor of horror. Some of horror is the escapism. We love to be scared. We love to root for the good guy or the bad guy. And then there's the other part of fiction. If it has verisimilitude, or if it has that life, if it feels like life, it's like, yeah, we don't often or always get closure in life. And as as an art, as in life, I don't know, there's a saying or cliche in there somewhere.
Do you have anything else on the horizon? What's coming up for you?
I've got short story releases in different anthologies coming out. The next one is a long title that I love to say. The short story is called A Loch Ness Monster Under the Light of the Southern Cross. Not the Loch Ness Monster, A Loch Ness Monster. And it's coming out in a book called A Darkness Visible from Ontology Press.
Ooh, okay. I'm writing that down so I can see that, because I love Loch Ness monsters.
All right. Well, we've got two things we'll have to get your way then, Jen.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. This has been really lovely. And, you are always invited back to the show to talk about any future projects. We're always here to help get the word out. We love helping writers. So
Thank you so much. Thanks for all the great work at the library. And yeah, we'll have to take you up on that offer. It's not every day we get the invitation to talk about Loch Ness Monster. So we'll come back and talk about some.
oh, awesome. Okay, listeners, now it's on you. You need to check out The Night Marchers, and you need to check out The Serpent Shadow. Thank you so much for listening. You should go to your favorite independent bookstore or library, wherever you like to go get your books, and check them out. Thank you so much for joining us. It is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.